Oh my god, it's finally here! No point doing an introduction, let's just jump straight into it.
Wow.
Alrighty, so we finally got our look at the new DLC, the Warden and the Paunch. First things first, massively missed opportunity with the name. The Grim and the Grom, or even the Warden and the Waw, both would have been significantly better names. Seriously, CA, hire me, I'll work for dirt cheap, and I'll take care of your names going forward. Anyways, back on track. I think as many of us expected, the new DLC does feature a head-to-head grudge match between Eltharion the Grim and Grom the Paunch. And we are going to take a deeper dive into all that in a moment, but as with any DLC, we also get some free LC toys at the same time. So first up, Imrek's going to be available for everyone as the free LC Lord option. So far we don't know a crazy amount of them in terms of gameplay, though we do know it does contain Draining a Daemon in some form or another. Continuing on the free theme, we also did get word about the Greenskin rework, both official and less than official. The WoW system's been dramatically improved, so now instead of being army specific, which never really made sense in the first place, it's now a campaign bar that can rise and be spent as needed. So when it's completely full, you can summon a new WoW army that can be launched at targets, and which provides a free and growing army to utilize. In battle, the WoW's effect is also dependent on the leaders themselves. Like, one of them gives you a whopping 50% more damage, and yet another gives terror to all friendlies map-wide, which, yikes, the balance for that's going to be atrocious. Anyways, as they've been craving for years now too, the orcs can confederate by just smashing the enemy's HQ in, kind of like what you do with Norska. And this goes a long way to helping you snowball quickly, but also I feel like it'll still be balanced because given the orc economy, it's probably going to be crippling to get too aggressive with because the amount of armies you'd have would just crush you. Also balancing things out too, their base diplomacy did take a swan dive off a cliff. Anyways, continuing things on, the orcs now have a scrap mechanic where they can utilize the enemy's abandoned resources to improve their own units, and this just on its own already looks incredible. Also, plus, it can be used as double duty for orcs in the inevitable total 40k down the road. Continuing on with that scrap mechanic too, I also want to bring up that the Greenskins now have access to unique lords in their tech tree, kind of like the Tomb Kings, and I absolutely love that, not only for what it does on its own, but what it makes available for the modders to start utilizing. Last on the freebies of list is a new mount for the Greenskins if you have Total War access. And seriously, I mean, if you're a big enough fan of Total Warhammer that you're watching this video, you should have already signed up for Total War access. It's free and it gives away a bunch of free stuff. Anyways, that mount is going to be the Catchweb Spider Shrine. It's a sweet looking spider mount available for the Goblin heroes, and I cannot wait to om-nom-nom some fools from atop it. Given how good the giant spiders normally are, the swings the pendulums on goblin characters from basically completely worthless in combat to terrifyingly powerful in combat, and so I think this was a really, really smart mount decision on CA's part. Alright though, let's start digging into the new content itself, starting with Eltharion. First things first, the voice actor for this here sounds amazing. They're like an elfy Batman. Eltharion himself is going to be a hybrid of a warrior and a mage using high magic, which, okay, fine, whatever, that's not all too interesting on its own. However, he does have access to really cool sounding campaign mechanics, to the point where I'm considering using him for my first playthrough of the new content. Yeah, even before Grom. First up, his ability to send enemies to jail. See, I did tell you he was Elfie Batman. He has an ability called Warden's Cage, which can target enemy characters, and if you take them out before it expires, you'll capture them as a prisoner. You can then interrogate the prisoners for useful intel afterwards. His other big party trick, and the one I'm also super interested to see, is essentially fortifying Ulthuan. By default, his base of operations is in disrepair, and his overall influence is extremely minimal. But as you begin to build everything back up, you'll start to gain access to special Ivres-only elite units, and you can eventually cover more and more of Ulthuan in a protective mist, until eventually you've covered the entirety of the island in it, which will apparently make it extraordinarily difficult to invade, which will be, again, quite unique within the Warhammer universe. Alright, continuing on to the rest of the High Elf editions, Archmages are finally in the game, and they're going to feature all 8 of the core magic lores, in addition to High Magic as well. So, I mean, you're going to have a ridiculous amount of lord options to play around with. They're also getting access to a Ranger hero, and this has a lot more implications than you might think, but I'm going to discuss that more at the end of the video, otherwise it's going to bloat this section too much. However, they're going to be a melee-only unit in spite of their name. They also might have the possibility of some basic magic, but that depends on what they do regarding the source material for this unit. I'm not really sure what they're supposed to add to the roster, but I'm never going to argue with more stuff, because more stuff's always awesome. I'm also not going to get into most of the new units that this adds, because frankly I'm sure you've already seen them elsewhere. However, the ones I want to point out are the ones that mod authors are going to get some benefits out of, starting with the new War Alliance. The downside is this kind of puts to bed any hope of Crass ever becoming a playable faction from CA, because I mean there'd be literally no point to it by now. However, on the flip side, I mean these are awesome looking new models, and now modders can pretty much use these to their heart's content instead. But moving over to the fat man himself, Grom's unique mechanic involves cooking. Nope, not even slightly getting there. By collecting ingredients from around the map, you can make dishes, which provide bonuses or even unique troops, and eating enough will eventually permanently boost Grom himself. He also still has Blacktooth's head from back when Blacktooth got decapitated, but Blacktooth's still alive and provides both sort of campaign advising and also exists as a banner that you can give to shamans, which allows that shaman to summon a rogue idol into battle. Also finishing out the Chunky Monkey himself, he's also a huge leadership buffer apparently, which is going to be extremely useful when you consider the fact he's a goblin-biased army leader, right? And also apparently when he gets into combat himself, that buff goes even higher. But I expect this is actually probably going to require some finesse to use properly, because even though he's permanently affixed to his chariot, he's probably going to be not the quickest lord on, well, I guess 2 legs is the wrong term for it, but chances are probably not going to be too quick of a lord. As for the new stuff, while the High Elves might have gotten more, I would say the Orcs got more interesting stuff. So first up, the Troll Hag. Bit of an odd pick for the eyes of some players, but for me it was a perfectly thematic choice to make, given Grom's history with the Trolls. They're a Lore of Death caster, but they're also likely to be a bit of a beat stick in melee, just because of the fact that it's a giant troll. Also speaking of trolls, both the River and Stone Troll variants are both being added in, which will also probably be likely really good news for the modding community, because there's 2 mods I can think of right off the top of my head that have a heavy emphasis on troll units. Continuing on our theme of big entities for a second, let's acknowledge the big obvious one in the room, the Rogue Idol. This bad boy's from the Monstrous Arcanum, and it looks utterly brilliant. Something else that's cool too is apparently it's supposed to be able to attack the walls in siege battles, which will be completely fantastic. Though I do kind of question why they didn't give that aspect to giants instead, given that the latter's already practically useless, and now it's going to be even more useless in comparison to the Rogue Idol. Lastly, however, the Pump Wagon does come screeching into the game with 3 different variants, actually 4 if you count the Regiment of Renown too, and honestly, this looks like one of my favorite new additions. It's kind of like a steam tank if a steam tank was made with paper mache, duct tape, and hope. Okay, but you've waited long enough, and this would be a pretty pointless video if all I was doing was posting the same stuff you've probably already gotten from 13 other sources by now. So let's talk about the stuff you didn't see from this announcement. I think Aeslin or Finubar is almost a guarantee for Game 3 now, because most of the obvious units and characters still missing are nautical themed ones. This was actually probably a pretty smart move by CA, as it gives the next High Elf DLC a lot more of an identity to use, while also decluttering this one a little bit. As it stands, this one's already somewhat kind of helter-skelter, but it would have been even worse had they not done it the way that they were doing it. I know some folks were disappointed that CA didn't give them the Lothran Skycutter, in spite of what is probably the single stupidest looking model in the entirety of GW's existence. But again, it's predominantly used by High Elf Mariners. If I were a gambling man, I'd have very little money to gamble with. But I would also bet what little I had on Aeslin being a Game 3 DLC Lord, along with the aforementioned Lothran Skycutter, Murworms, probably the rest of the Sea Guard, and then either Sea Lords, Commodores, Stormweavers, or Mist Mages, pick and choose as appropriate. This would be a pretty cool thing to do with a third map too, because it's a very naval-happy looking setting. It would tie in utterly amazing to have like a High Elf versus Vampire Coast, or maybe even like Long Drong Slayer Pirates, or anything weird and niche. There's a lot of options on the table here, that was my point, and I think CA was extremely smart to not take the obvious bait with what they could have done here. They've left themselves a lot better options in doing so. So earlier I also said that the High Elf Ranger making an appearance was quite interesting, and that boils down to its source material, that being Warhammer Quest. If you're unfamiliar, Warhammer Quest was an RPG from like way back in the 1990s. It was like, well, picture Dungeons and Dragons, but with a Warhammer skin tossed over top of it. Now, on its own, this probably doesn't interest you in any capacity, and that's a totally fair reaction to have. But myself, I'm completely elated by this, because Warhammer Quest sits perfectly in between Warhammer Fantasy RPG 1st and 2nd edition, way back when the really obscure, unique lore was the name of the game. Like, even if nothing else, even if we restrict this exclusively to Warhammer Quest, that means that the Pit Fighter could potentially go from just a useless character item to a full-on character someday, because they were fully fleshed out in Warhammer Quest. But if we're going to open this up to the more obscure stuff that the earlier lore allowed for, we could get really cool stuff like halflings or even hedgefolk someday, which would be amazing for the long-term content options. It's actually worth noting that a lot of the stuff that came out from this pack came from non-standard sources. So I already mentioned Warhammer Quest and the Monstrous Arcanum, but also Forge World, The End Times, and Storm of Magic are all sources that donated into this, and I can't help but see that being able to pick and choose from all these different source materials is a fundamentally great thing for CA to have access to. There's a ton of brilliant lore that was never part of the core army list stuff. So again, this is not really part that people have been focusing on, but it's a really, really good thing to have available. But my fellow fans, I have saved the best for last. So first things first, hats off to Subsphinx on the forum for noticing this, but it's extremely probable that we're getting Skaven in the last DLC. And there's actually even more proof than what Subsphinx found on the forums. So first up, let's start with their evidence. The logo for the DLC that just came out, actually. If you look on the bottom of the right vertical line towards the bottom, there's a Skaven logo. Okay, who cares, right? Well, so far, every time that logo has appeared, the Skaven have appeared directly after it for the content. So, for example, during the Hunter and the Beast, it had this logo down at the bottom, and the next DLC was the Shadow and the Blade, which of course featured the Skaven. However, that DLC's own logo lacked the Skaven logo, as did the DLC that preceded the Hunter and the Beast. So this is not like the standard that it just shows up all the time, and instead it actually shows up specifically when the Skaven are set to emerge escape next. Yes. Okay, maybe you're not convinced though. Maybe to you, this is just super coincidental. I mean, hey, they showed off that same logo on the Game 2 teaser videos too, even though I would point out to you that the Game 2 teasers also ended up putting out the Skaven in the next content, the content actually being Game 2. Alright, so then fine. Let me present my next bit of evidence, the map. Let's start with Mordheim. So now, or I shouldn't say now, in the coming DLC, it's going to be occupied by Clan Creepus. Now, Clan Creepus is almost assuredly not going to be the next DLC because they're effectively just thralls of Clan Eshin. They got some cool lore behind them though. Next up, however, Oakenhammer has been renamed to Craigmere, and it now belongs to Clan Ferric. Again, I wouldn't really put my money on Clan Ferric being the next DLC. As cool as they are, they'd essentially just be a halfway point between Clan Scryer and Clan Moors. However, Clan Spittle, a clan notorious for decorating themselves in lizard entrails, is also on the map, although they've been weirdly moved to the wrong spot with this last update. Not really sure why there. However, we also now see Clan Vulcan. They could also be a fun addition because they're essentially flame-obsessed rats who use volcanic obsidian in their armor. But again, I doubt that they're the next pick. So, like, what kind of evidence is that? 4 Skaven clans, all of whom are unlikely to be DLC options? So on its own, no, that's not very good evidence, I agree with you. But it's interesting to note that the Skaven are being put in and shuffled throughout the map, and that Mordheim is a location notorious for having been overrun by the Skaven. Like, that's literally what Mordheim's known for. Lastly, if you look at the game itself, the High Elves and the Lizardmen now have 6 lords each, while the Skaven and the Dark Elves only have 5 each. So the next DLC, you could effectively say, is a 2-horse race between, well, Dark Elves and Skaven. And I would say that the Skaven have way more obvious gaps in their lineup than the Dark Elves do. I'm going to take a much deeper dive into potential options for the next DLC some point down the road here, but for now, I am leaning heavily towards the Skaven being one of the next options for this DLC though. Anyways, though, that is going to wrap it up for this particular video. I'm interested to see just how horribly this mangles up my mod list, but I'm going to stay on top of things and I'll keep you on the loop if something goes tragically wrong. As always, though, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.